This photo started my interest in the Lindbergh barnstorming stop. It was in a collection of family photos of the Goller family. I asked Jerry Grebner, Lake Region Times editor, if we could run a copy in the paper to see if anyone else had information to confirm whether it might be taken at that time or not. Well, readers did step forward, but before we solve the mystery of this photo and hear from local families, let's see how Lindbergh remembered his time here. After barnstorming with others, he decided he wanted his own plane. When he purchased his Jenny in Americus, Georgia at an Army surplus price of $500, he didn't admit he had never soloed before. His purchase included 2 extra propellers. He took off, barnstormed around Texas and other southern locations to get the feel of it, cracked up outside Mobile, Mississippi. There goes one spare propeller. His father urged him to come north. Money to be made there, he said, so he did. His father wanted him to help him with his political campaign. On his way to meet him in Shakopee, he was met by a severe thunderstorm and was forced to land in a swamp at Savage, Minnesota. There goes the second spare propeller. That took him to Glencoe, Minnesota, where he and his father had another mishap, but they were unharmed. By this time, the plane needed a mechanic. The Glencoe mishap happened when the wheel got caught in a little ditch, tipping over and breaking the propeller and some parts of the landing gear. Out of spare propellers, Lindbergh had to wait for a replacement. In the meantime, a local garage owner and mechanic, Jesse Benson, and his 17-year-old son, Heston, helped him repair the metal parts. According to Heston's son, Jim, they took an instant liking to each other. Upon completion of all the repairs and replacement of the propeller, Lindbergh asked Heston if he wanted to learn to fly by going along on the barnstorming tour. He did, and left with Lindbergh, much to the dismay of his father. He became a student flyer, being the pilot between towns as they continued barnstorming in southern Minnesota. When they arrived at the towns, he would sit in the front cockpit, crawl out and walk between the spars and wires of the wings to attract attention and promote rides. When the crowd gathered, he would stand by the Jenny and caution people not to get too close to the propeller. Together, he and Lindbergh barnstormed in Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota, and of course, Minnesota. Even when Heston returned to Glencoe after the summer of 1923, he kept in touch with Lindbergh and continued flying, eventually owning planes of his own. Grandson Scott and son Jim continued the flying interest. They are both pilots and promote flying by working with the Young Eagles program based at the Glencoe Airport. Scott inherited a vintage propeller from his grandfather, which he displays in this picture.
One evening, while I was waiting for chance passengers at a field in southern Minnesota, a car drove up with several young fellows in it, one of whom was a graduate of the Army Air Service training schools.
We're not sure if Madison Lake became his destination because the town had a good mechanic, or if he was following railroad tracks, but he landed in Louis Fitcher's wheat stubble field. Not a swamp or a drainage ditch, and no animals in sight that might chew up the wing. Glenn Allen was probably one of the most important people in Lindbergh's early flying career. He could fix most anything, and he was always trying to figure out a way to make things better. Glenn was quite a guy, Fred Mueller-Liley told me. Glenn's father, G.W. Allen, was one of the first business people in Madison Lake. In 1941, Madison Lake would say goodbye to the Allen family when Glenn and his family moved to Gig Harbor, Washington, to open a plumbing and pump installation business. When World War II started, they worked in the Navy shipyard.
More than one person credits Lindbergh's stop in Madison Lake for being part of his future success. Glenn and Lindbergh worked on the engine, finding rubber segments in the gas tank. Having gone through the Army Air Service training school, he recognized the benefit it would be to young Lindbergh.
Bonnie Allen said, "My dad was a stern, taskmaster. I can still hear him tell how Lindbergh, with his engine now tuned up, took off from Fitcher's Field for a test flight. He just missed hitting the chimney of J.J. Brown's home west of the pasture. When Lindbergh landed, he was a bit shaken, but Dad advised him to hop right back in there and try it again. Lindbergh stayed at the City Hotel, and this is where he wrote his letter asking for enrollment materials for Army Air Service flight training. Robert Madigan, the owner of the City Hotel when Lindbergh stayed there, was a community-minded leader. He had served 2 terms as county commissioner. He made many friends through his fair dealings and good judgment. Their youngest child, Laverne, was still living at home at the time of the barnstorming. Her ride was so important to her it was included in her obituary, right up there with her pride in being Irish. Laverne would become an elementary teacher. After the engine had been worked on, Lindbergh continued barnstorming in the area, over the town of Madison Lake and Duck Lake, where the lift was considered good. The Schrammel family said he used their farm as a place to give rides. He offered the children in their family free rides, but the older folks said no. They considered it too dangerous. In this aerial shot, we can see the City Hotel and the large stable behind it. It was a good shelter for the horses that the rural mail carriers used. Because the barnstorming happened before Lindbergh was famous, there weren't a lot of photos. The first one of Sylvester Farrell with the plane is from the Frank Sullivan collection. The second photo, shared by Larry Cordum, is of Sylvester Farrell and neighbor George Cordum. George's family said he talked to Lindbergh but didn't take a ride. He was a very tall man, so maybe his size had something to do with it.
My name is Mary Ann Green. I'm from Redwood Falls, Minnesota, and I'm a daughter of Agnes Tarpey Bornicke and Elmer Bornicke, who rode with Charles A. Lindbergh in 1923. He was barnstorming in the Madison Lake, Minnesota area. And I remember a little bit about stories that my mother talked to me. And my father and my mother both rode for Charles A. Lindbergh. And my dad had ridden first. And when he was getting out of the airplane, he looked at a young lady and he said, "Hey, little girl, would you like an airplane ride?" And he said, "I'll pay for it." So he paid for it, and we still have the check. It was a $10 check, and Lindbergh charged $5 for each one of them. And so here is the check. I don't know if you can see it or not, but anyway, we have that check. And what I do know about the ride, it was both a ride and a love story, because my dad, he stayed down and he waited for my mother to come back. And when she came back, she said that was the scariest ride she ever rode. There was no straps, nothing, just wire and open. And he took her to her family farm and tipped the plane, and she was sure she was going to slide out of that plane, and she feared plane rides. So that part I remember, and after the plane ride, they started dating, and they dated for 2 years and got married, and they were married for 50 years, a wedded bliss. My dad put my mother on a pedestal. She was the princess of our home. And at her age when she died, she was 93, and she said, I will um, never forget that ride. That's the most wonderful thing that I ever did was ride with Charles A. Lindbergh.
Another picture taken in Madison Lake has been discovered. They are Ralph Russell and Marie Britt, who lived on farms in Lee Ray Township. Ralph was a country school teacher in Minnesota and North Dakota and was a farmer throughout his life. They married in 1936 and had one son. Marie was diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis in 1940 when their son was only a year old. She was hospitalized at the Southwest Minnesota Sanatorium in Worthington 2 years later and died there in 1946 at the age of 49. She was hospitalized 4 years. Cedric Hager was 18 at the time of the barnstorming. He farmed east of Madison Lake. 2 years later, he would be married. He and Millie had 2 sons. Jack, one of the sons, did become a pilot. One of Lawrence Wolf's granddaughters told us her grandfather took a ride. He would have been about 60 years old at the time. He came to America from Germany with his parents and siblings when he was 5 years old. He was farming near Madison Lake when Lindbergh barnstormed here. His wife was the former Pauline Hayne, also part of the early settlers of the area. They had 2 daughters and 3 sons. Their older daughter joined the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and their sons continued the farming tradition. Their second daughter married a local farmer. Even after moving to Washington, Glen Allen's daughter Bonnie kept in touch and shared her story of the time when Lindbergh shared their family meals. She is the one who described him as shy, seldom looking up from his plate while eating. She wrote that she and Max Lysdale didn't weigh much, so they rode together. Herb Nervevig lived on Point Pleasant Road, and he would become a Mankato optometrist. He was related through marriage to Muggs Taylor. Muggs, or Morgan, was probably enjoying a summer vacation at the Brett cottage. By all accounts, he was a very talented young man. He went on to college at Carleton, where he was on the swimming team. He died tragically in a car train accident at St. Peter when he was only 21. Dayton Casper talked about how he loved going on the ride. He became a farmer and owner of gas stations, including one at 9 Mile Corner. He didn't have his own plane, but his brother Milt did and was part of the Flying Farmers of America. This news article was printed the year Lindbergh became famous, 4 years after the barnstorming stopped. It lists some additional people from Mankato who took a ride. They probably were enjoying their summer at Point Pleasant, even had their names listed in the local paper as guests. Mrs. Wilbur Taylor was the mother of Morgan, who Bonnie Allen mentioned. Mrs. C.K. Mayer's husband, a newspaper man, was active with Mankato business groups and would later be elected mayor of Mankato. Robert Cheeseborough would have been about 13 years old at the time of the barnstorming, probably enjoyed boating with Morgan Taylor and Herbert. He graduated from Mankato West and eventually moved to Florida and owned a marine center in Vero Beach.
One of the longer, more expensive rides was taken by Gesto Murillo, a native of Mexico. He was part of the workers who settled in the Madison Lake area to help with the sugar beet farms. He and his wife lived in Minneapolis for a few years, but returned to Madison Lake in their retirement years. Not everyone who would have liked to have ride could, maybe because the $5 cost was just too much in those days and they just didn't feel secure enough. 2 lads, Leo Sullivan and Frankie Knapp, scrounged together the $5 and then flipped to see who would be the lucky rider. The winner is Leo. He tried to get into the plane by stepping on the fragile fabric wing when Lindbergh stopped him. Well, if it's that flimsy, I'm not going to ride. The wings were covered by a cotton linen fabric, made taut by covering it with dope. As it dried, it became tight like a drumhead. The dope was very flammable, so welding or smoking by it was dangerous. To get an idea about the fabric was like, the Wright brothers used cotton called Pride of the West, the same fabric used for women's undergarments. Barnstormers usually kept extra fabric with them to repair tears. Melvin Ose, the local newspaper editor, wrote, in 1923, boys' shirts cost 50 cents. Jersey milk was 10 cents a quart, and men's heavy overalls were $1.95. As Don Bornicke told me, in those days, $5 was $5.
Adeline Hartung told her granddaughter that the parish priest took a ride. His fee was paid by donations. After all, his salary was only $108 a month. While serving in Madison Lake, the brick veneer was added to the exterior of the church. He also served at Spring Valley, Rose Creek, and Adrian, his last parish. A native of Wisconsin, he attended the St. Paul Seminary. This picture was taken 20 years later in 1943 after he was named Monsignor. While I was writing the newspaper series about the barnstorming, a picture taken at Smith's Mill was brought to our attention. It was a treasure saved by Warren Reese. His mother Mina had also taken a ride. It happened that Warren had ties to Madison Lake, having been a local bank director for many years. It sounds like the Reese family of bankers, but it is spelled differently. When we interviewed him, we had the added bonus of hearing his story of competing in the Wabasha, Minnesota Grumpy Old Men competitions. On Sunday, probably the last day of Lindbergh's visit to Madison Lake, he wanted to barnstorm in Mankato. He found out he needed a permit. To get a permit, he needed a notarized affidavit attesting to the safety of the plane. Glenn Allen again helped him out, asking a notary he knew, Henry Leonard, for such a statement. Henry's daughter Elizabeth was at their home when they came to pick up the permit. She was offered a free ride, which she would have taken, but her father said no. They did go to watch others take rides from a runway of sorts on 3rd Avenue. Elizabeth had a young daughter at the time. She would become Sister Renee, a beloved teacher at Madison Lake. This isn't Lindbergh, this is Lawrence Solar, 20 years old in 1924, with his Jenny. He smoothed the grassy strip on 3rd Avenue in the spring by using a team of horses pulling a railroad tie. When pilots flew over Mankato, they looked for town names and directional signs like this one on the roof of the building next to the post office. The sign to the grassy strip not pictured was on top of the Brett's building. The 3rd Avenue strip, now where the ADM plant is built, is where Elizabeth watched the barnstorming, accompanied by her father. According to Lindbergh's log, about 11 people took a ride that day. Solar was instrumental in creating the improved airports in the Mankato area. The Janesville paper included this nugget of news. According to Charles's book, she enjoyed the rides around southern Minnesota. And according to Lindbergh's flight log, he gave rides to about 70 passengers in the Madison Lake, Mankato, Janesville, and Smith's Mill area during the week. This is a true account of a special day of Mary Lorraine McCarthy Mullenhour's life, growing up in Marysburg and the Madison Lake area. She didn't share it with anyone until she was in her early 80s. Her son, Jerry Mullenhour, has memories of books on Lindbergh being around the house, and at the time he didn't understand the true sense of connection their mother felt until she shared this story with the family. I appreciate them forwarding this story to us. Mary Lorraine attended All Saints School in Madison Lake, graduating as valedictorian of her class. She became a teacher. Here is her story. Here is a picture of Mary Lorraine as a toddler in front of her grandparents' home, Jeremiah and Mary Frances Lyon McCarthy's, across the road from Marysburg Church. Fast forward to 1925. As we were all getting ready to go to the Marysburg Church picnic, a plane flew overhead. It was flying low and looked like it might be in trouble trying to find a landing place. It descended lower and began to fly around in circles. My sister, brother, and I used to wave at planes because our Uncle Pat used to fly with Glenn Allen over to our farm. This plane was different. As the plane came lower, we hollered, "Come on down!" We watched it a while, and to our amazement, it really did land in our wheat field. We were in the cornfield next to it, however, and we were so shocked that he landed, we didn't run over there right away. We got in the car with our dad, who drove us through the field to the area where the plane had landed. The first thing I remember, a big, tall, blonde aviator with goggles and a flying suit hit the ground and asked my dad if he could land there. He said he'd give us free rides. My dad said fine. Jack, Betty, and I became scared, and we were awestruck, thinking it quite a feat to even see a plane, as there weren't many in those days, let alone that would land on our farm. We never anticipated the plane would do this, even though we did wave at it to come on down. The tall pilot asked my dad what was going on over there, referring to the picnic with all the cars. My dad, Lester, told him it was a picnic at the Marysburg church. The blond pilot said he saw the cars and thought it was a good place to give plane rides. My dad thought it would be okay, and the pilot and his co-pilot noticed all the people thinking this would be a good place to give rides for $5 each. Of course, he'd never interest my grandmother in riding in a plane because at that time some people thought it was foolish or even odd to even think of flying in one. To give you an idea about the picnic, my mother, Pearl Weckworth McCarthy, had her picnic basket packed with 2 pies, 2 cakes, chicken, and the fixins. My dad, Lester McCarthy, was hurrying across to the church to help mash the 20-gallon bowls of mashed potatoes. I remember he used a big masher, much like churning butter by hand, only on a larger scale. It was an event of campaign speeches, horse races, and ball games. Lots of people attended from great distances. The pilot stayed the rest of the afternoon, and many people did take a ride as the field was only a short distance from the picnic grounds. The family of George Cordham have shared that he talked to Lindbergh, so it's likely it was at this picnic, but he didn't take a ride. I went back to the picnic and worked until later in the afternoon. Then I went to the plane as I found out that my grandpa, dad, sister, and brother had all had a plane ride. They asked if I wanted one, so my uncle, who was accustomed to riding in a plane, said he would go with me. It was an experience I'll never forget. It was very windy inside because it was an open plane, but the view of the farmland squares reminded me of what the birds saw. I saw a patchwork of greens from the air. The view below was astonishingly small, and for a minute it felt so surreal. My grandpa, who was interested in planes, the engine, pistons, height, and speed, visited with the aviator, who was glad to tell him about his Curtiss JN-4D biplane. He also asked the aviator where he was going to go next, because it looked like he was getting ready to leave. He said he was headed north to Little Falls, and that since he saw the cars, he thought he'd stop and earn some money. Grandpa asked the blond man, who he knew as Charles, if he had a map so he wouldn't get lost. He said he did, but that he knew the area very well, having lived in Minnesota and flown in the area several times. He told Grandpa his name was Lindbergh, but at the time his name didn't mean anything to us. From the Lee Sewer Center Leader. The Lee Sewer Center community boasts of a first-class airplane photographer. Did not know that, did you? Well, it's a fact. Last week when the aviator was here taking folks up for a ride, Ben Traxler, north of town, was one of them. He took his small Kodak and succeeded in making some fine views. Although the pictures he made are small, they are exceptionally good for pictures of that size. A couple of them are views of the town, and in one of the town views, one may see Clear Lake at Lexington. Another good photo is one of the Lee Traxler Place, just west of town, showing the farm buildings, the trunk highway, and railroad where they cross. Ben says he got a good ride and could see 7 lakes while he was up. The pictures made by the local young man are likely the first views made here, and certainly the first made by a local citizen. The camera pictured here is one that was sold in 1925 and does fold up very compactly.
The Madison Lake Historical Society established a park to commemorate the Barnstorming stop. They raised over $1,000. Even though Don Bornicke is not in this picture, he was a very important contributor to the establishment of the park, building, and the driveways and hauling in gravel.
I think the plaque says it all. When still a daring young flyer barnstorming southern Minnesota in August 1923, Lindbergh landed in the wheat field just northwest of where this plaque is located. A devil-may-care youngster, he took up adventurous customers at $5 a ride. He remained in our village 4 days, rooming at the city hotel. Here he struck up an acquaintance with young Glenn Allen, something of a flyer himself, and as Allen had a garage near the field on the southeastern corner of this park, the two often worked on Lindbergh's fragile, two-winged fabric craft, the now famous JN-4D Jenny. Allen, a family man, urged young Lindbergh, single, to enroll as an air cadet in the U.S. Army Air Corps at Brooksville, Texas, which he did. From then on, his rise as a U.S. male pilot was meteoric, culminating in his electrifying solo, nonstop flight across the Atlantic to Paris in 1927.
We tried to keep the story alive by including the local historical society of 1998 and the town 4-H club in a tree planting ceremony for Arbor Day.
So what happened to the Jenny? Well, it did crash in 1927 and then sold for parts and found in a barn in Iowa in 1973, and CAL initials carved on the wing rib, so they knew definitely that it was Lindbergh's. It was restored by the Long Island Early Flyers Group in 1976 and displayed at the Northwest Bank in 1982, where it survived a fire. And then it was at Minneapolis Main Terminal for a few years. Now it's at the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Long Island, New York. Thanks to an aircraft specialist at this museum, I have more information about my mystery plane. It was a Lincoln Standard, not a Jenny, a Standard SJ-1. Lindbergh did have a Standard, but I can't confirm that it was Lindbergh in the picture, although the specialist did admit Lindbergh wore his helmet that way with the ear flaps up. Even though he was only 5 years old when Glenn Allen was helping Lindbergh repair his airplane, Madison Lake resident Harlan Frederick shared a passion for aircraft. He had completed 300 hours of study and practice in the aircraft sheet metal course at the Lincoln Aeronautical Institute of Airplane and Flying School in 1940, when he was drafted into the Army. After World War II, Harlan and his brother Donald purchased an Aeronaut Champ No. 7. The aircraft was purchased for crop inspection and investing in finding new fields. He used it primarily for searching for phalaris grass, known as canary grass, and that often grew in sloughs, so this was a much easier way to search for new fields. When his brother died in 1959, Harlan had to sell his first plane. 20 years later, he found an abandoned plane of the same make as his first aircraft and rebuilt it. It was used for enjoyment and reminiscing of those early days of flying. And more on the Lysdale story. Even though Max didn't continue flying, his younger brother Jack, who was 10 years old in 1923, did. He credited his interest in aviation to an exhibition when an airplane landed on his high school's football field, which was actually a dry slough. He started out as a pilot at the Mankato Airport, worked at Ryan Aircraft in San Diego for a year, owned and operated an aircraft repair shop in Mankato for 3 years, and flight schools in Worthington and Minneapolis for about 10 years. He also operated government flight schools during World War II. In 1949, he started Lysdale Flight Service in South St. Paul and began managing the South St. Paul Airport, also known as Fleming Field, until 1970. He was listed in Who's Who in Minnesota and was president of the Minnesota Aviation Trade Association of Airport Operators. A son of Frank Goller featured in the first photo, Gordy is a pilot in this World War II 1941 Stearman he restored. He owned more than one plane during his lifetime. His love of flying had started in the 50s, and he took countless flights with his wife to check ditches, crops, enjoy the scenery, and spend time at his cabin up north. His cross-country excursions included the destinations of Colorado, Texas, Virginia, Alaska, and Hudson Bay. I appreciate all the help I received in preparing this program about the Lindbergh barnstorming stop. Fred Mueller-Liley contacted me when I started writing the series and invited me to his home on more than one occasion, and we discussed the history of Madison Lake many, many times. The Bornicke family was very helpful, and all the historians that I've met along the way. The contributors often gave me pictures, stories, and just lots of encouragement. And thanks to my son James for helping with tech support and the narration.